Hello, my name is Richard E. Brown. This is part 7 of a series on Christian heresies. It addresses a category of heresy called Monarchianism. It will specifically look at Modalistic Monarchianism, also called Sabellianism, and Dynamic Monarchianism, also called Adoptionism. Don't worry if you are not familiar with these terms. All will be explained in this video. And if you enjoy this video, please check out my Theology blog and resource site. Here is what we have covered so far in this series on heresies. Part 1 covered the 4 natural heresies as identified by Friedrich Schleiermacher. Parts 2 through 5 each addressed a specific heresy: Gnosticism, Arianism, Marcionism, and Montanism. Part 6 addressed the Christological heresies of Apollinarianism, Monophysitism, and Nestorianism. We will now dive into a category of heresies called Monarchianism. In part 1 of this series, I included this slide. It shows the major Christian heresies that have been debated and condemned throughout church history. I have assigned numbers corresponding to the video in this series where each heresy has been addressed. This part addresses Monarchianism and the related heresies of Sabellianism and Adoptionism, shown here in blue. After this, the only major heresy that will not have been covered so far is Socinianism. Let's start off with a preview of Monarchianism. The term is derived from the Greek word monarchia, which is a combination of monos, meaning alone, and archos, meaning leader or ruler. Monarchianism is therefore a belief system that has only one ruler or leader. As a heresy, Monarchianism emphasizes the oneness of God and therefore denies the Trinitarian position that God consists of 3 persons. This single-person God is sometimes referred to as the monad, which is a term in Greek philosophy corresponding to the supreme being of the universe. There are 2 major forms of monarchianism. The first is called dynamic monarchianism, which is also referred to as adoptionism. The second is called modalistic monarchianism, which is also referred to as Sabellianism. I will explain each of these 2 major forms of monarchianism on their own slide. Let's start with dynamic monarchianism. Remember that all forms of monarchianism deny that God is 3 persons. And so dynamic monarchianism believes that Jesus was born a normal human being, but he was special due to the virgin birth. Jesus was then empowered by God by being filled with the Holy Spirit, which occurred at Jesus' baptism. In this heretical understanding, the Holy Spirit is simply a power that God infuses into the man Jesus. The Greek word for power is dynamis, which is why this heresy is called dynamic monarchianism. Even after being empowered by the Holy Spirit at baptism, dynamic monarchianism holds that Jesus was still a man up until his resurrection. At this point, God adopts Jesus and Jesus becomes divine, but of a lesser divinity than the one supreme God. This is why dynamic monarchianism is also referred to as adoptionism. Dynamic monarchianism was taught in the late 2nd century by a man named Theodotus of Byzantium. He was a Valentinian Gnostic, but unlike Valentinianism, which taught that the person of Christ entered Jesus at his baptism, Theodotus believed that it was simply the power of the one God that entered Jesus. Dynamic monarchianism was declared heretical by Pope Victor I, and Theodotus was excommunicated in 190. Theodotus nevertheless continued to acquire disciples, forming the Theodotians, a sect that lasted about 200 years, up until the end of the 4th century. And so dynamic monarchianism is the first form of monarchianism. The second form is called modalistic monarchianism, or the shorthand version of simply modalism. Modalistic monarchianism was first taught by a man named Praxeas in the late 2nd century. This was shortly after Theodotus was excommunicated in 190. But it became much more prominent through the teachings of a man named Sabellius, a 3rd century priest and theologian. None of his writings have survived, and so most of what is known of Sabellius is from writings of his opponents. Sabellius referred to his movement as monarchianism, but the Greek fathers in their writings typically referred to the movement as Sabellianism. As with dynamic monarchianism, modalistic monarchianism denies that God consists of 3 persons. However, the one God, the monad, reveals himself in different ways called modes, faces, aspects, roles, or masks. Those who watched the previous video in this series, which is on Christological heresies, may recall that the Greek word prosopon refers to a stage actor's mask. This is how modalistic monarchianism explains God. God can put on the prosopon of the Father, the Creator, put on the prosopon of the Son, the Redeemer, and also put on the prosopon of the Holy Spirit, the Sanctifier. It is the same one God that can simply reveal himself in 3 different ways. One of the theological objections of modalistic monarchianism is that it has the one God suffering on the cross. But a purely divine God cannot suffer. Therefore, opponents of modalistic monarchianism often called it by the pejorative term patripassionism, from the Latin pater, which means father, and passio, which means suffering. Pope Calixtus condemned modalistic monarchianism as a heresy and excommunicated Sabellius in 220. But the movement persisted for about another 150 years until the Trinitarian formulation of the Nicene Creed was asserted in 325 at the Council of Nicaea and again at the Council of Constantinople in 381. We now move on to our good friend Tertullian, who we can always count on to have written against the prominent heresies of his time. Tertullian was a prominent Christian theologian from Carthage and is the first Christian to produce a large amount of writing in Latin. He is often referred to as the father of Latin Christianity and as the founder of Western theology. His writings are the first to use the word Trinity. Although a prolific author of dogmatics and apologetics, Tertullian's most famous works are arguments against heresies. We will be looking at the second writing on this list titled Against Praxeas, or Adversus Praxium in Latin. This excerpt is from the first paragraph of Against Praxeas, which is essentially Tertullian's introduction to the heresy of modalistic monarchianism. Tertullian writes, "Manifold are the ways in which the devil has shown his enmity to the truth. He has at length striven to shatter it by defending it. He claims that there is but one God, the all-powerful creator of the universe, in order to make a heresy even out of that one. He says that the Father himself descended into the Virgin, that he likewise was born of her and himself suffered, even that he himself is Jesus Christ. In truth, however, it is Satan who has been a liar from the beginning. He and any man he has privily sent of his own accord, such as Praxeas. For it was Praxeas who first, from Asia imported this kind of perversity to Roman soil. Tertullian, as is typical for him when refuting heresies, uses very strong language here. He credits Satan with spreading the heresy of modalistic monarchianism through praxeus, which Tertullian also describes as a perversity. Beyond this strong language, notice what Tertullian highlights about modalistic monarchianism in this introduction. First, that since the Father is not Trinitarian, it was the Father himself who entered the womb of the Virgin Mary and was born into this world. Not only this, but it was the Father who suffered, which refers us back to modalistic monarchianism being sometimes referred to as patripassianism. Tertullian goes on in the remainder of Against Praxeus to explain why modalistic monarchianism is theologically problematic and how a Trinitarian view of God, that God consists of three persons but a single substance, represents the true Christian God. Against Praxeus is considered Tertullian's greatest work on the defense of Trinitarian theology. This brings us to the end of part 7 of this series on heresies. There are 4 main takeaways. First, understand the term monarchianism and that it refers to a category of heresies that deny that God consists of 3 persons. That is, monarchianism denies Trinitarian theology. Second, understand that there are 2 basic forms of monarchianism. The first is called dynamic monarchianism, where Jesus is born a normal human, is infused with God's power at his baptism, and then is adopted by God into divinity upon the resurrection. This is why dynamic monarchianism is also referred to as adoptionism. Third, understand that the second basic form of monarchianism is called modalistic monarchianism, or simply modalism. It holds that the one God, or monad, simply reveals himself in 3 ways, sometimes as God the Father, sometimes as God the Son, and sometimes as God the Holy Spirit. With this understanding, it must have been the one God who suffered on the cross, which is why critics sometimes call modalistic monarchianism patripassianism. This form of monarchianism was first taught by Praxeus, but was more famously taught by Sabellius, which is why it is also referred to as Sabellianism. Last, understand that because of its theological difficulties, the refutation of monarchianism led to many of the early church fathers, such as Tertullian, to develop and defend a Trinitarian understanding of God, which is now a fundamental Christian belief. Thank you, and God bless.